She was left alone in the hospital, with 4 newborn babies and a shattered heart. 12 years later, he returns, trying to fix what he destroyed. But what he finds is more than he ever imagined. In a small town in the interior of the United States, Jennifer Walker seemed to have the perfect life. Married to John Walker, a successful entrepreneur, she lived the American dream until a big surprise would change everything. Jennifer found she was pregnant with quadrigs. The pregnancy, although full of expectations, became a nightmare for Jennifer, as unexpected complications led her to hastily. John, initially excited about the idea of being the father of 4, gradually moved away from his career more than his wife and pregnancy. When Jennifer gave birth to the quadrigs, an event that should be celebrated became the beginning of a nightmare. John, unable to deal with responsibility, disappeared. He abandoned Jennifer at the hospital with his 4 newborns without explanations. Jennifer's pain was immense, but alone, she faced the challenges of motherhood, taking care of her children without the help of anyone. Over time, Jennifer managed to overcome the abandonment, but the hurt persisted. She never heard of John again, and life went on without much surprises until, 12 years later, an unexpected call arrived. John, now older and divorced, felt that he needed to do something to solve the mistakes of the past. Unknowingly, he decided to go back to the city where he had left everything behind, and there he found Jennifer and his children. By knocking on her door, he was about to find out something he never imagined. Jennifer Walker, now 36, was an unshakable woman. During the last 12 years, she built a solid life for herself and the 4 children she had raised alone. Quadrigs, David, Sarah, Ethan, and Lucas, were now in their teens, each with a distinct personality, but united by the deep connection with the mother. David, the oldest, was the protector. I always warned the brothers to any danger and worried about the well-being of all. Sarah, more sensitive and dreamy, had a more idealistic view of life and always dedicated himself to helping her mother in everything. The twins, Ethan and Lucas, were inseparable, with such a strong bond that it seemed impossible to separate them. Jennifer, with her mid-time work, could keep her math up to date, always catching her children ahead of her own needs. Each day it was a challenge, but she never let herself down. When the children were at home, their laugh filled the environment, making the house a home, despite the difficulties. But unlike Jennifer, John Walker had followed a very different way. He never had the strength to stay firm, and his life in recent years has been marked by personal and professional failures. His marriage to a new wife collapsed rapidly, and the company he had helped build came into collapse. He felt he was stuck in a cycle of failures and could not overcome what he had done with his first family. Each day, guilt consumed him more, until one day, without explanation, he made the decision to return to the city, where he abandoned everything, and with that, his children. When John arrived in the small town where Jennifer lived, he came across a simple but very welcoming house. The scenario, which seemed to be a memory of the past, now reflected Jennifer's resilience. What most shocked him was to realize how much he had lost. The children he never really knew, the woman he knew he loved, but to which he had caused immeasurable pain. The city seemed silent, but to him, it was like a cry that he called him to face the consequences of his betrayal. Meanwhile, Jennifer was in a new phase of her life. She had overcome the abandonment, but still keeping in her heart the scar left by John. She remembered him as a man who had not knew how to be strong, neither for her nor for her children. Time had not erased the pain, but it had transformed it into something different: strength and self-sufficiency. It was with a mixture of anxiety and coldness that she opened the door when she saw John outside. The years had passed, but the man in front of him was the same. He looked older, more tired, but his eyes still carried the same uncertainty. The door opened slowly, and she invited him in, not by sympathy, but because she felt that this moment needed to happen, if not for them, at least for her children. Jennifer's children, now teenagers, were at home at that time. They didn't know who that foreign man was at the door, and when he entered, their reactions were immediate. David, always protective, was the first to look at the stranger and observe his presence with suspicion. Sarah, who always had a more dreamy view of life, seemed curious but cautious. Ethan and Lucas, the twins, looked at each other, still processing what was happening. While John tried to find words to justify his absence, Jennifer felt increasingly pressure. She needed more than ever to step forward, not to forgive him, but to show her children who he really was. The silence that settled in the room after John's entrance seemed dense. Each of Jennifer's sons observed curiously, and at the same time with slight distrust. David was the first to break the silence, looking straight at John and, in a firm voice, asked, "Are you our father?" The simple question seemed to weigh more than any word John could have said at that moment. John felt a tightness in his chest, a feeling of being pulled into an abyss. He looked at the four young people, now before him, and the weight of 12 years of absence seemed almost unbearable. He wanted to say something, anything that convinced them that he was there to do the right things, but the words did not go out. Jennifer, watching the scene, felt a whirlwind of emotions. She knew that moment was crucial. She didn't want her children to be obliged to accept John immediately, but she also knew the truth about him needed to be said. She took a deep breath before turning to her children and firmly began to explain. "This man is his father. He was absent from your birth. He abandoned us when we needed him most." The truth, naked and raw, was like a shock for everyone in the room. David, always the most protective, kept his eye fixed on John, with his fists clenched. "You abandoned us. How could you do that?" he said, his voice shaking with anger and disappointment. Sarah, with an expression between shock and sadness, looked at her mother, seeking explanations. "But why is he here now?" She turned to John, still trying to understand the reasons for his appearance. 12 years later? What do you want now?" John, unable to speak immediately, looked at Jennifer. She knew he was struggling to find the words, but his frustration was showing. He did not know how to justify his absence or how to explain what had led him to make those decisions in the past. Guilt consumed him, but the words he tried to articulate were not enough to relieve the weight of his mistakes. I don't know what to say," John finally said, with a low tone, his voice failing. "I'm a different man now. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know how to correct it. Life, my life, it became a nightmare, and after so long, I felt that I needed to do something. I know I can't erase what I did, but I'm here trying to understand what happened and perhaps find a way to at least meet you." And then, the most unexpected happened. It was Ethan, the most silent of the four, who approached John. With a curious but cautious look, he said, "You were so worried about disappearing that you never thought about what it would do with us, right?" These words hit John as a punch in the stomach. He did not expect one of the children, which he barely knew, would be the first to speak to him so directly and sincere. Ethan was right. He had lost everything. And it wasn't just the time he had passed. He had lost his children's confidence, and the distance he had raised was now a difficult wall to transpose. David, still enraged, looked at his mother and said, "I will never understand how he can come back after all. After 12 years. What does he want? We forgive him?" Jennifer, who hitherto kept her calm, felt the weight of the question. She knew that her children needed time to digest everything, but she also knew that the pain of being betrayed and abandoned did not disappear overnight. "It's not about forgiving or forgetting, it's about understanding what happened, and maybe it helps us move on," she replied, her calm voice, but with a firmness that was characteristic of her. Jennifer turned to John and without hesitation asked him, "Why now? Why did you come after so long? What do you expect? What do you want from us?" John felt the intensity of the question. He was not prepared for it. He felt he could no longer lie or hide the truth. All he wanted was to reconnect, but he didn't know if he would have enough time or opportunity to do that. He looked at Jennifer, his heavy eyes of regret, and said with painful sincerity, I have no excuses. But if you give me the chance, I want to try to be someone better. For you. For everyone." The mood in the room was tense, and Jennifer's sons looked at each other, trying to understand what to do. The decision to accept it, or was not in their hands, and the pain of years of absence still weighed in their hearts. After the confusion and tension of that first date, the following days were a sea of conflicting emotions. John continued to appear at Jennifer's house, trying to establish a bond with his children. He knew that if he wanted to earn his trust, he would have to do more than just apologize. He needed to show that he had changed, that he was there to be a real father. Jennifer, in turn, began to realize that John's presence brought a mixture of feelings. The hatred and anger of the past were still there, but she also felt a touch of compassion, something she didn't expect to feel anytime soon. She was trying to be rational, but the fact that he was there, trying to be part of his children's lives, made her vulnerable. She didn't know what would be worse, to ignore him completely or give her a chance to prove her value. David, the eldest, had his own internal questions. He felt responsible for the family, always taking care of his brothers and mother. John's behavior bothered him deeply, and he felt that by accepting him, he would be betraying the memory of his mother who, during all those years, was the one who really sacrificed himself for him and his brothers. The idea of forgiving that man, who had never shown interest in being a father, bothered him even more. He did not know what would be worse: forgive John or keep him away and keep carrying the weight of responsibility alone. Sarah, on the other hand, felt a different pain. She wanted to believe John's change. His dreamy and hopeful side always sought a happy ending, something that could heal all the wounds of the past. She didn't understand how someone could abandon her own family, but she couldn't ignore what she felt as she saw him there, at least trying to approach. She didn't know if she was being foolish, but she believed that perhaps forgiveness was the only way to healing, to herself and her family. Ethan and Lucas, the twins, were more closed than ever. They were always the most connected to each other, and the situation with John seemed distant, something they couldn't completely process. They didn't remember John, and the idea of a strange father in the middle of the family confused them. They were more interested in living their lives, focusing on school and their own interests, but the emotional impact of having such an absent biological father affected them in ways that they could not even understand themselves. John knew things would not be easy, but he also understood that if he wanted to regain any kind of relationship with his children, he would have to be patient. He began to invest time in the small things. He accompanied his children in his activities, talked to them without haste, trying to approach naturally without forcing an instant connection. He knew he couldn't just expect to be accepted. He had to gain their trust, something that would be a much greater challenge than he imagined. Meanwhile, Jennifer's life continued, but she could no longer ignore the impact of John's presence on her home. She couldn't understand how a man could move away for so many years and suddenly come back and want to be part of her children's lives. She was beginning to question her own life and the choices she had made. Was she wrong to never allow her children to know about her father? She had done this to protect them, but now she was seeing their conflict with John's presence. She didn't know what was the best way to deal with it, if she should move further or somehow try to promote reconciliation. Deep down, Jennifer knew that the way would not be easy for anyone, but she also knew her family was now in a crossroads. The decision on how to move on, whether they would forgive John or maintain the distance, was in the hands of their children, and she, as a mother, would need to be ready to support any decision they made. Time has passed, and John's attempts to reconnect with his children began to become increasingly frustrating. Although he was striving, the way seemed longer and more difficult than he imagined. With every gesture of goodwill, Jennifer's children seemed to distance themselves even more, as if they could not trust the man who had been absent for so long. It was on an ordinary afternoon during a family dinner that everything changed. The four children were sitting at the table, more tense than normal. Jennifer tried to keep the conversation light, but the feeling of discomfort was in the air. David, as always, was the first to break the silence, his fixed gaze in John, with an air of distrust. "I just don't understand," he began, his serious voice. "How could you disappear and never look back, as if we never had existed?" John, who had hitherto been a little calm, could not avoid pain in his own chest. "I don't know," he replied with a hoarse voice. I made a terrible mistake, and there is nothing I can do to go back in time. I know you are hurt, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I just understand you, have a chance to show that I'm different now." But then something unexpected happened. Luke, who had kept silent throughout that time, stood abruptly from the table. His eyes were full of frustration. "You're asking for something you don't deserve," he said, the tremendous voice with anger. 12 years is too long. We must not just forget that you left us, and now you want everything to be like before. But that won't happen. You have no right to go back and wait for everything to fix it." John, shocked by Lucas's intensity, tried to approach him, but was interrupted by Sarah, who was visibly distressed. "It's not fair," she exclaimed, rising from the chair. "I wanted to believe you were here to change, but it's hard. How do you expect us to trust you? How can we trust a man who was never here when we needed him?" The tension in the room was palpable. The pain, the anger, the regret, everything seemed to explode at once. John was in shock, but I knew I needed to hear the truth, no matter how hard it was. David then, with a laden voice, said, I've always been responsible, always took care of everyone. And you? You haven't been here. You didn't do anything. There's no way to come back now and change what happened." Jennifer, who hitherto kept silent, stood up, placing his hand on David's shoulder. She knew that despite the pain, it needed to be said. "David is right," she said, her voice low and firm. "We went through so many things without you, without your help. I did everything alone, and the children have grown alone, without you. Now do you want everything to change in the blink of an eye? It doesn't work like that." John was still, absorbing every word that was said to him. The truth was clear as the day. He had been selfish and unable to realize the impact of his choices, and at that moment he felt like the true extension of what he had lost like never before. But the revelation did not stop there. It was then that Sarah, with a deep sigh, said, "We don't want you to be our father. Not now. Not after all that happened. We can't just accept you back." The silence extended heavily as each word resonated in John's heart. The weight of his own mistakes crushed him, and he knew that nothing else could be done. But somehow he was grateful to finally hear the truth he feared, but knew he deserved it. John got up from the table, feeling the weight of rejection, but also a strange relief. He knew this was not the happy ending he expected, but it was the only chance for him to face the consequences of his actions. There were no more justifications. All he had was the guilt, the pain and awareness that he perhaps could never rebuild what he had destroyed. But as he turned out to leave the house, a voice stopped him. Jennifer, who watched him with eyes that mixed anger and compassion, finally said, "You can't fix it all, but if you ever decide that you really want to be someone different, you really want to do the right things, you'll always be welcome. Not to be the father you've never been, but to be at least a part of whom you can be now." John looked at her, and for the first time in many years he felt a spark of hope. I didn't know what the future reserved, but at that moment he knew that perhaps there was a chance for him to try to be a better person. The following days were difficult for everyone at Jennifer's house. The rejection that John faced was hard, but somehow he knew it was something he deserved. As he tried to digest what had happened, Jennifer and his children also needed to deal with the consequences of everything that happened. The air in the house was heavy, and the emerged tensions would not disappear so easily. David, still with a heart full of anger, moved away more than ever. He didn't know how to deal with what had happened. What did it mean to be the son of someone who had gone for so long? He felt that although he had taken the family's reins when John abandoned her, now there was something inside him he no longer knew how to control. He felt that if he accepted his father, he would be losing his own identity as the responsible, as the one who has always taken care of others. But at the same time, he felt that he could not keep carrying that weight alone. Sarah, on the other hand, was divided. She wanted to believe the best of people, but what she saw from John made her question her own worldview. The desire to forgive was there, but she knew she couldn't do that without permission of herself. She didn't want to be naive, but couldn't help but ask herself, what if he really changed? What if we don't give a chance, we lost something we'll never have? Ethan and Lucas, the twins, were in their own world, trying to process the situation more distantly. For them, it was hard to understand why John wanted to go back now, when they barely remembered who he was. They were more focused on their own lives, and as much as the situation affected the home environment, they were not ready to deal with the emotional impact of having such an absent father. For them, the dilemma of forgiveness seemed something distant, something that would need much more time to solve. Jennifer, meanwhile, was trying to be the rock for everyone, but also felt the pain of the hard words he had thrown to John. She knew that, in a way, he was right. It would not be easy to forgive him, but it would not be fair to let him go without even considering what he had said. Anger and resentment were deeply rooted in her heart, but she knew that he had been vulnerable to finally admitting his mistakes. She didn't know what the right way would be, but she knew she needed to make a choice not only for her but also for the children. It was then that, in a silent conversation between her and David, the truth finally began to emerge. "I know it won't be easy," Jennifer said with a tired voice she had never shown before. "I don't know what to do with John with this situation, but I also know that we can't live in the past forever. He made a mistake, and you are right to be hurt. But I also have to think about how we can move on as a family." David, his eyes full of frustration, sighed, but agreed. "I know, Mom. I just don't know how to do this. How can I forgive someone who just turned my back on us?" Jennifer looked into his eyes, realizing that he was lost. She knew she didn't have all the answers, but what she could offer was the space for him to find his own way. "I don't know, David," she replied, "but we can't carry it forever. It's not healthy, and you deserve to live your life not just because of what happened in the past." The conversation was a moment of turning to both. Jennifer and David finally began to understand that, as hard as it was, forgiveness was not just about accepting John back, but about releasing the pain that imprisoned them. Meanwhile, John was on his own journey of self-supply. He didn't know what the future reserved, but something inside it had changed. He knew that no matter how much his children would not accept him immediately, he still had a role to play in their lives, even if it was that of a distant viewer. He understood that when seeking reconciliation, he would need to be patient and let time do his work. It wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to wait, no more by immediate forgiveness, but for something more genuine, a chance to one day be accepted again. The days turned into weeks, and Jennifer's house began to reflect the change, though slow and painful, which was happening inside everyone. The air of tension still hovered, but now there was also something new, a silent will to try to move on. Jennifer and her children were beginning to understand that the healing process would not be immediate, and perhaps for the first time, they were willing to allow time to work in their favor. David, although still distant, began to open to the idea that he didn't have to carry the weight of everything on his own. The conversation with his mother, about forgiveness and the release of pain, had planted a seed. He didn't know exactly how to take the first step, but one thing was certain: he didn't want to live in the past anymore. He began to realize that his anger and resistance to John were no longer just about what happened, but about what he had become because of that. He was more than the son who took care of others. He was someone who also needed to be careful, someone who also deserved to be happy. Sarah, with her dreamy nature, began to open to the possibility that forgiveness would really be the way to peace. She became more attentive to the small changes in John's behavior. Although she still had doubts, she was touched by his sincerity. He was no longer trying to be the perfect father, but a man who was gradually trying to reconnect. She felt that if she could, she would give him a chance to show who he really was now. This, for her, was a step towards the healing of all. Ethan and Lucas, the twins, were in a more neutral place. They still did not feel the need to forgive or reject, but carefully observed the processes of others. They were more focused on their own lives, but realized that something was changing inside their mother and their brothers. They were not ready to deal with John's situation, but they couldn't ignore the tension that gradually dissipated from the house. Perhaps, over time, they would start to see things differently. Jennifer, in turn, was at a crucial point in her journey. During the years of child rearing, she has always put herself in the background. She had sacrificed her own desires and needs to guarantee the welfare of her children. But now, with them starting to grow and following her own ways, she felt it was time to finally wonder what she wanted for her own life. She still carried the pain of abandonment, but also realized that this pain could not define the rest of its existence. She needed to allow herself to be more than just a mother or wife. She needed to allow herself to be an entire woman with her own dreams and aspirations. On a silent night when the children were in their rooms, Jennifer sat on the porch watching the stars. It was a moment of reflection, where she finally could hear herself. She knew that while her children began to take her own steps to healing, she also needed to do the same. There was no room to live only because of what John did or failed to do. She had raised a family, she had been strong, and above all, she had survived. Now she was ready to allow healing to happen inside her too. It was at this moment that she decided to take an important step to herself. She would begin to rebuild her life, not because of the past, but by herself. And if the future included John, it would be something she would face with her head up, knowing that she had done what was needed to be whole again. John, in turn, continued his walk of redemption. He knew he couldn't force anything. He began to understand that confidence, once lost, is not immediately regained. He was learning to be patient with himself and others. With each little gesture, he tried to show that he had really changed, not only to his children, but also to Jennifer. Although their relationship was still marked by pain and distance, he felt he was on the right track. Not to be the perfect father, but to be a man more aware of his choices and their consequences. The growth process was, for everyone, a daily challenge. But the truth was, after so many difficulties, they were beginning to realize that, As painful as it was, forgiveness and overcoming were necessary to move on. They did not need to forget what happened, but they could finally choose not to let the past control the future more. Life at Jennifer's house began to follow a quieter pace, but the change, though visible, was still far from completed. The 12-year-old scars would not disappear overnight, but gradually each of the children and Jennifer began to understand that there was a possibility of reconstruction. The presence of John, still distant and cautious, seemed finally accepted with less resistance. He, with patience and effort, was beginning to find a way to insert himself into his children's lives, not as an authoritarian father, but as someone trying to learn to be part of the family. David, though still hesitant, began to show signs of wanting to approach John. He came to realize that his anger was not only harming his own happiness, but also affecting family dynamics. It was not easy to forgive, but David felt that he needed to try, for the good of the family. He understood that time could not be recovered, but he could still perhaps build something new with John, even if it was a very different relationship from what he had imagined. Sarah, in turn, approached John. She saw in him a vulnerability that touched her heart. She knew he would never be the ideal father, but she also knew no one was perfect. For her, the chance to try to understand who John really was now, and giving her a chance to be more than the man of the past, was something that was worth it. His optimistic view and his ability to dream with happy endings seemed to be aligned with the attempt to at least give the reconciliation process a chance. Ethan and Lucas continued to observe everything from afar, even more focused on their own lives in school. But there was something in their eyes that showed a silent acceptance. They were not ready to delve into a relationship with John, but at least they saw him anymore as a stranger. They understood in their way that the situation required time, and that perhaps one day things were different. Jennifer, in turn, knew she was approaching a crucial decision. She had already taken many steps on her own healing and overcoming journey, but what bothered her most was her place in it all. She has always been the strength of the family, but she was beginning to realize that for a long time she had forgotten herself. She didn't know which way to go with John, if she should try to rebuild some form of relationship with him, or if she could finally move on without him. The moment of decision was approaching, and Jennifer knew he could no longer postpone the choice. The balance between the pain of the past and the hope of a better future needed to be found, and she would have to do it for herself, before doing for her family. On a silent afternoon when everyone was busy with their activities, John approached Jennifer. He looked calmer, more centered, but still with the weight of guilt on his shoulders. He knew the way was still distant, but was determined to continue. "Jennifer," he started with a quiet voice, "I know nothing I say can erase what happened, but I want to be here, not only for them, but for you too." Jennifer looked at him with a serious expression, but with a touch of soft eye. She knew that her words were sincere, but at the same time she felt that he still did not fully understand the depth of what he had done. She also knew he couldn't solve everything with a single sentence. "John, you can't expect everything to be solved just because you want to. That's not how things work." But something in the tone of his voice, something in the way he looked at her, made Jennifer realize that despite her scars, she was no longer alone on her journey. She had faced the pain of abandonment and difficulties without him, but now, looking at him, she saw someone who was willing to do the impossible to rebuild. Maybe it wasn't a perfect reconstruction, but the attempt was there, palpable, true. Jennifer knew that the moment of the decision was coming, and with him, the challenge of moving on, whether with or without John. But she also knew that regardless of the way she chose, she no longer needed to carry all the weight on her own. She was ready to make her choice, without fear of facing the consequences. The day arrived. The moment of decision was before everyone. The weeks of attempted reconciliation, silence, and small steps to healing culminated in a single moment. Jennifer felt the weight of this choice on her shoulders. She knew that what happened from that moment would change not only her life, but that of the children and John. Their lives would never be the same. The question was, would it be for the better? John had done everything possible to show his transformation. He was more present, more aware of his actions, and his regret gestures were evident. But the truth was that he didn't know what would be enough to gain the confidence of his family. He had failed before, and despite all his efforts, he knew there was a long way to go. All he could do now was wait for Jennifer's decision and his children. That day, Jennifer called him to a conversation without his children around. She knew it was time to face the truth once and for all. John arrived at the living room, his eyes loaded with emotion, but also with the serenity of someone who knew the end of the journey was closer than he would like. He looked at Jennifer and, with a sigh, said, "I don't expect you to forgive me, Jennifer. Not right away. But please know that what I want most is to see all of you well. I can't erase the past, but I want somehow part of the future." Jennifer watched him for a long moment. The silence between them was loaded with history, pain, and many words not spoken. She knew that what he said was true, but he also knew he couldn't expect immediate acceptance. His pain was still very fresh, and for his children the situation was even more complicated. "I know you regret," Jennifer started, her low but firm voice. "I know you're trying, but, John, things can't just be as they were. What happened won't disappear because you want to, and I can't just forget it." She paused, feeling the weight of her own words. "But I can't keep carrying that weight on my own either, and maybe you should not carry yours alone either." Jennifer looked at him, his expression mixing anger and understanding. "I can forgive you. Not today, not now, but maybe one day. But I can't promise that everything will be as before, and the children, they have the right to decide on themselves what they want. Forgiveness is not something we can force, John. He comes in the right time." Those words were punched in John's stomach, but he knew they were true. He could not force reconciliation. He needed to let time do his job, and perhaps someday he could approach his children again. But now he just wanted Jennifer to know that he was there, willing to try, willing to do whatever was needed. At that moment, David entered the room. His expression was serious, but there was something in his eyes that indicated a change. "Mother," he said, looking at her and then to John, "I don't know if I will ever see you as the father you should be, but deep down, I understand it's not just what you did. It's about what we are now. And maybe it's not the perfect father you want to be, but maybe you can still be someone to us." Sarah came in behind David with a hesitant expression, but with the same desire to try. "I want to believe people can change," she said softly. "I don't know what the future reserves us, but if you're here for us trying, maybe I try it too. It won't be easy, but I'm a dreamer. I want things to work out." Ethan and Lucas, though still distant, seemed more understanding. They had observed everything from afar, and now when they saw their brothers starting to open, something inside them also began to change. They were not ready for a warm hug, but they were beginning to understand that forgiveness was not about erasing the past, but about choosing a future that was worth it. John, with teary eyes, looked at each of his children and for the first time in 12 years felt a small spark of hope. It was not the kind of forgiveness he expected, but it was the beginning of something new. He knew that the way ahead would be long, but he also knew that this was his moment of finally proving that he could be someone worthy of being there. Jennifer looked at him, feeling a mixture of relief and anguish. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she felt that she finally was no longer alone on her journey. She didn't need to forget the past, but now, perhaps, there was a chance to move on. The past still existed, but they were ready to face the future, together or separated, but with the promise that finally each would have a chance to rebuild what was possible. Time followed, and Jennifer's house became a place of transition, where the past and the present were in unexpected ways. Reconciliation was not instantaneous, and forgiveness did not materialize immediately. But for the first time, everyone was willing to try, to look at the future with a new perspective, albeit marked by the pain of the past. John, although still facing the weight of his actions, began to make small steps toward his children. With every gesture of patience, with every honest conversation, he tried to prove that he was not the same man who had abandoned them. I knew that trust would not be restored overnight, but he was willing to follow the way, without promises of perfection, but with the determination of being someone better. David, over time, began to open his heart. He was still cautious, but he understood that his role in the family was not to carry all weights alone. He allowed John to approach, without demanding that he was the perfect father, but accepting that he at least wanted to be part of the family. He learned that forgiveness did not mean forgetting, but learning to live with the imperfections of all, including their own. Sarah, with her heart full of hope, helped maintain balance. She became the bridge between her brothers and John, encouraging them to try. She knew that forgiveness would be a long journey that would not be easy, but she believed that, with patience, she could help her family find a place of genuine reconciliation. Ethan and Lucas, quieter, still observed the process. They were not ready to embrace John as a father, but gradually they began to see him as someone more than just a distant memory. They accepted that time was necessary for scars to heal, and that if their relationship with John became something else, it would be at their own pace. Jennifer, in turn, was learning to live for herself. She had already given so much to others, and now she was facing an opportunity to rebuild her own life, to find a balance between being a mother, woman, and person. The healing process was not complete, but she knew she had taken the first important step in allowing herself to look at the future, without the weight of the past, by defining every moment. The way ahead would be long, and perhaps the happy ending that everyone sought was a continuous journey. But one thing was certain: they were willing to move on, no longer due to the failures of a man or the choices of the past, but for the desire to be a family again, even in new terms. They didn't know what the future would bring, but they were finally ready to face it together with hope, patience, and perhaps even forgiveness. 12 years later, Jennifer's house became a place of reunions and new beginnings. John, still in his path of transformation, was more present than ever, but not as an idealized father. He was now a man who had learned to respect the time and choices of others. Jennifer, stronger and more resolute, found a balance between mother and woman's roles, finally allowing himself to be entirely. His children, now adults, built their own lives, but knew that over time they could count on each other, and perhaps a father who once redeemed himself. And have you been through moments of pain and reconciliation in your life? How do you deal with forgiveness and lost time? The story of Jennifer, John, and his children reminds us that while the past cannot be erased, the future still offers us the chance of reconstruction and healing. Share your reflections, your experiences, and inspire others not to give up, even when everything seems lost. Forgiveness is a long way, but there is always a chance to start over. Don't let the past determine your future. Choose move on.